Today we're speaking with hockey expert and historian Liam Maguire. Liam is regarded as the world's #1 NHL historian and published author of 4 books on the subject. He has worked with 65 Hockey Hall of Fame members and has made more than 2,500 appearances as a host, MC, and keynote speaker in almost 4 decades, and is also president of Liam Maguire Hockey Enterprise, Inc. He joins us. I was going to say he joins us from Ottawa, Canada, but because of coronavirus, he's actually stuck in Philly at the moment. So what are you doing at the moment, Liam?
Jess, how are you, buddy? Great. Thank you very much for having me on, my friend. I very much appreciate it. And it would have been 2,501 tomorrow night, but the coronavirus has taken care of that. So I'm out of bounds. I'm off limits, and I've been out with a bunch of former NHLers for the last few hours, having some dinner and a few adult beverages. But I'm back here to talk some hockey with you, and looking forward to it. So it's been a great ride. Unfortunately, got derailed here for this particular trip, but God willing, we get through this as a planet, because this appears to be pretty global right now.
Pretty big.
And we're back on track as soon as possible and go from there.
So can you get when you talk about getting beers in Philly, can you get anything from the north? Do they serve Labatt to you pretty much on Coors and Budweiser when you're down there?
The funny thing, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm at a hotel right now, and I've hit a couple bars tonight, and there's no, a couple guys have pinged me on social media and said, no, there's bars around that serve Molson products. And I said, well, not where I was. So, I couldn't find what I typically drink here in Canada is a beer called Molson Export Ale. So, Molson's is a fairly well-known global beer brand. They are now part of the Molson Coors conglomerate, which has to be in the top percentile of beer distributors globally. I know there's so many across the world, or where you are, or certainly in Scandinavia or Europe, wherever. But Molson X is an ale. It's a bit of a bitter ale. It was founded in 1903 under the Molson umbrella, and it's the longest serving brand actually under the Molson umbrella. They had different types of lagers when the brand actually started in the 1800s, but Molson X has been around continually since 1903, and since 1967 I have continually drank it. And it is not available in West Philadelphia, born and raised. A little bit of fresh twist there for some of your younger listeners, but because I'm in Philly right now, but I don't know if in the West or North or East or South, whatever. But we just went over to New Jersey and drank at a bar over there where a lot of former Flyers, I guess, congregate, and a few were there tonight, and we had a lot of fun, and it was great. But no Molson X, Jesse. So I am currently right now, as I sit here and talk to you from my hotel room in Philadelphia, drinking Miller Lite.
Ouch. I remember, I think before we turned on the recorder, I said I was home last year, and the whole time that we were out east in Quebec and Ontario, I was able to get Molson Export and even branded cans of Molson Export with like the Habs and all that.
Yeah.
And then, but as soon as you get out west, they don't even serve it. So growing up, I always drank Molson Dry, and that's a 5.5 beer. And over here in Australia, most beers are around 4.2. So I don't even think I could probably handle going back onto Molson Export after living out here for so many
Well,
years.
I didn't even leave the hotel tonight before I drilled about 20 drafts back. I mean, American draft beer, you may as well be drinking water. It's carbonated water is really what it is. I mean, the American beer is probably even lighter than. I didn't know that about Australian beer, what the percentile was. And I mean, that's kind of it's a bit of a misnomer. I think people get caught up in that. There was a beer back in the day in my youth, Molson Brador, which was 7%. Now, I gotta tell you right now, if you had 6 or 7 of those, you could tell the difference for sure from drinking Molson X, which was 5%. I mean, domestic Canadian beer is 5%. Our light beer is 4.5, which is Coors Light, whatever light beer in Canada is, whatever province you're in. But domestic beer in Canada is 5. And they got a couple of outliers, but now there's 9,000 craft breweries. They spring up every week, but I'm an old school guy, and I'm pretty freaking loyal, man.
At all,
I'm Molson X.
I think
Yeah,
it's pretentious. I don't want an aftertaste after I have a sip. I'm not interested in tasting berries or the fairies of the forest. Just let me have a drink at an affordable price.
exactly. Because you know what that does, Jess, is it drives me to drinking double rums.
Yes, nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. But I think that the theory I always had is that because I'm down in Oz, the alcohol is slightly more diluted again because most people are drinking out in the sun in the middle of a 30-degree day. And that's it's a slightly different concept to sitting around at home where you don't have to drive or get around anywhere.
Yeah, no, I hear you, man. I hear you. That's good stuff. That's good stuff.
Anyway, now that people are probably going to click forward 5 minutes to get through to the hockey stuff, which is what we're really here to talk about tonight. So, when I reached out to you, and again, thank you for doing this with us. So, for those, a lot of people are going to know who you are. I think before I reached out to you, I found out about a couple of your podcasts. I've seen you on the Reddit hockey subreddits as well. You've been good enough to correspond with people out there as well. So sort of the theme that we're going with today that I had floated with you is to look at some of the most important moments in hockey history, some of the players, and what we're just going to do is see, what we can get through within about an hour or thereabouts without exhausting your time. Because I think it's already 10 o'clock at night over there at the moment, isn't it?
Well, Eastern time, it's just after 11 p.m.
After 11.
Eastern time as we're taping this. I'm assuming you're taping. I don't know if you're going live or not, but
yeah, we're recording. I was looking forward to the Canucks versus Avalanche today to watch over here. That obviously didn't happen. So
yeah, no, it's a little after 11, but I'm good, my friend. I don't have any, as you know, now my event tomorrow night's been canceled. So I take my gigs very seriously. It's how I've made my living for almost 40 years. And I bill myself as the NHL expert of the world. It's kind of a gratuitous, statement to make, but, I feel for, 4+ decades I've backed it up. So, and I'm going to do that on your show here right now.
Are you sure you're not American? That sounds rather boisterous.
I know, right? Yeah, you don't get Canadians saying that, but I get a lot of people say, "Man, you'd make a great American." It'd be an honor actually to be south of the 49th in that sense. But no, I'm an unbelievably proud Canadian, and I literally would fight morning, noon, and night, verbally or physically to defend the Canadian honor, flag, and what have you, especially hockey. But it's just something that I felt about 20 years ago or so when I was about halfway into this whole regime as the internet, I guess, really.
Actually, that's a good thing. Why don't you give us, you mentioned that you are the sort of preeminent name in this. How did you become that? Why don't we just talk about how you got to this point before we start blasting you with questions?
Well, Jess, it was very organic. There was I'm 60 years old. I'm born in 1959, and I grew up as a young boy in the 60s and then, in elementary school in the 60s through the early 70s and went to high school in 73. And in those days, the hockey cards, which was a salvation for first of all, I played hockey. Everybody did. Every boy played hockey, everywhere. Everybody, boy at school, every boy that was a friend of mine, everybody played hockey. And we were hockey fanatics, and we bought the hockey cards. And in those days, the anecdotes on the back of the cards were neat. It was a lot of really neat little significant type of factoids. Yeah, exactly. And I just started, I was 10, 12 years old, just memorized them. And along with, of course, your favorite players, goals and assists and the other pertinent information. And you would challenge them against your friends who were Leaf fans. I was a Hab fan. And, there was only 2 teams in Canada at that time until Vancouver came and made it 3. It just was sort of a rite of passage, but I'm very blessed, very, very blessed with a great memory, thanks to my late father, from Dublin, Ireland, by the way, Noel Patrick McGuire, born and raised Irishman, made Canada his home. He's no longer with us, but, my first hero. And my mom is from Quebec City, a little village north of Quebec City, and her family is actually known for their memory. And I just seem to have an ability to be able to remember, especially numbers, and obviously pretty good on names. And it just kind of grew from there. And then I attended an exhibition game in Ottawa. Back in those days, in the late 60s and early 70s, many NHL teams used to play exhibition games in Ottawa, and in some cases would even hold their training camps in Ottawa. And for example, we had the infamous Ted Green-Wayne Mackey fight, September 21st, 1969. That happened right here in Ottawa. It was an exhibition game. And in 1974, I went to a game with 5 high school friends to see the Montreal Canadiens play the Chicago Blackhawks. And to see who was going to be in the lineup, I wanted to see if Yvan Cournoyer was going to be in the lineup. He was my favorite player of all time. Born November 22nd, 1943, Drummondville, Quebec, 5'7", 178. I know all his numbers. and to find out if he was going to be in the lineup, you had to buy a program. It cost $2. In those days, no toonies. You had to pay a $2 bill. It was kind of reddish, pinkish in nature.
I remember.
And you remember them, of course, Jess, you would. And I paid it and took the program as we all did. All 6 of us took the program. And we watched the game. Cournoyer played. Montreal won. It was the first time I saw him play live. I was ecstatic. My dad picked me up, took me home. I went home that night. I couldn't sleep. I was so excited. I read the program cover to cover. I remember looking at the names: Todd Blake, Dickie Moore, Elmer Locke. I mean, Rocket Richard I heard of, but, Howie Morenz I heard of, but Earl Joliet, Wilf Cood, Bill Durnan, Kenny Reardon. There's so many names that I never even knew, and these were Montreal Canadiens. I didn't know these guys. And I went, what the hell? I call myself a Montreal fan. So I read that thing cover to cover. And the next day at the cafeteria at St. Pius X in September of 1974, me and Brian LaRue, the late Paul Horscroft, Andrew Marquis, gone now as well, Dave LaFrance gone. 3 out of the 6 are now no longer with us. Sad to say. Rob Drapeau, myself, Chris Trainer, that was the 6 of us. And we had a little contest amongst us to see who remembered the most overnight. And for whatever reason, I did. I mean, when I think of it now, it was so innocuous, but I got this instantaneous reputation as a hockey expert, and I knew nothing. But I got this instantaneous reputation. So I said, Jesus, I better bone up. I better know Rocket Richard scored 544 goals. I better know he got his 500th October 19th, 1957 against Glenn Hall. I better know that Jean Beliveau wore number 12 in his first game ever as the Montreal Canadiens. I better start knowing these things if I call myself a Habs fan. So then I started studying on the Montreal Canadiens. And then 12 months later, as I'm walking down the hallway, a young man 1 year behind me, his name was Gord Mladic. He was in my brother Mike's class, and he came up to me. He had his cousin visiting from the United States of America, where I am right now. And he said, Liam, I was telling my cousin all about you. You're a hockey expert. He's got a question for you. I said, yeah, go ahead. I think he's going to ask me a Montreal question. He says, Liam, who won the Stanley Cup in 1933? What? Who won the Cup in 33? I went, oh, my God. I don't know, but I know it was an American team. And they freaked out. They freaked out even that I knew it was an American team. And I went home that night and I said, everyone in school has called me a hockey expert. Everyone says I know everything. I don't even know who won the Stanley Cup every year. So I sat down that night and I memorized who won the Cup every year, team they beat, how many games, and who scored the Cup winner. And ever since then, I've added on every year, obviously, because we're talking 46, 45 years ago. And in 1933, it was the New York Rangers, and they beat the Toronto Maple Leafs in 3 games straight. It was a best of 5. They called it the tennis series because the scores were 6-2, 6-4, 6-2. And that's how I rolled, Jess. And that's how it started. And it became an absolute insane passion for me to become the absolute king of NHL trivia and statistics. So much so that I took an old hockey sweater of mine and I had embroidered on the back, NHL trivia expert. I wasn't even of age. I had my fake ID, as we all did in Ottawa in those days. And I went to the bars and I drank 5 or 6 beers and I took my jacket off and would point my back to the biggest part of the crowd so they could see my sweater. And then inevitably they'd wander over and they'd say, "What's with the shirt, kid?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm the expert of the world." "Yeah, what does that mean?" "Well, what that means, Mr. Giant, is you can try and take me on for $1 a question, or a pint of question. Your pick. And I did that religiously, night after night, weekend after weekend, month after month. And then I started going to Montreal. And I started doing it on the bus down to the Montreal Forum, where I started going when I was 16 years old. 15 years old. I wasn't even 16. First game I went to, Saturday night. Third game, the semifinals, 1975, May 1st. Guy Lafleur's first playoff hat trick. Montreal won 7-0. I was there. I was in the building. I saw Henri Richard play. I saw Spinner Spencer play for the Sabres. I saw the French Connection. I saw everybody. I saw Lafleur's first playoff hat trick. I was in the building. And things just took off at that point. From there, I started to get a rep around Ottawa. I went on radio in 81. That's a longer story I won't bore you with, but suffice to say that I got an opportunity to go on radio on May 21st, 1981. 2 hours. They paid me $75 to answer nothing but hockey questions straight. I missed 7, over 2 hours. I remember it vividly. And then, boy, things really took off for the next decade or so. That's it in a nutshell, brother.
Cool. Very good. That's a pretty good summation. All right. So the theme that we're going with is sort of great moments again. So as I said, before I reached out to you, I was doing a little bit of research. We want to talk about ranking, I guess, some of the most important moments in hockey history. I had seen a separate interview with you, and someone had asked you a very similar question, and you said, without hesitation, nothing comes close to it. It's really the Summit Series of 73.
Yep.
And
72.
72, sorry. I know this is on coinage, it's part of national moments and all that. And I said, as one of the questions I asked you before we got this recording started, this is a bit of a particular Canadian moment, but for a lot of younger people, like when you talk about going on the air in May of 81, I'm not even born yet. And so a lot of the people that are going to be listening to this now are probably 20, 25, 30. And as one of the things that I notice, even with, as I said, I run business periodicals and stuff, and especially with the onset of guys like Bernie Sanders in the States, kids these days have no concept of the Cold War, Soviet Russia, and what this meant to civilization at the time. Do you want to give us a context of this series of games and what that meant to hockey and Canada as a nation at the time?
Yeah, I would like to point something else out first, because obviously, as you say, your audience is probably younger, and let's just say hypothetically you had Bobby Orr on Skype right now doing your show. I mean, Bobby Orr retired officially in 1979. So that's 2 years before I went on the radio, and suffice to say that most of your listeners wouldn't know me. But the point is, if you had Bobby Orr on, or let's say Gordie Howe was still alive and you had him on, they're not going to be talking to you about the 1990s and 2000s. They're going to be talking, obviously, they would assume that you're having them on to talk about their era. And despite the fact that their era precedes their birth and their parents may even have been infants, the fact is that they are the men who created this hockey history. The Summit Series, despite the fact that it's before the majority of people listening. I mean, if you say to what's the most significant moment in Canadian history, you'll get a number of different answers. Mine would be June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious landing in the history of mankind. And the Canadians landed on Juno Beach and went further inland than any other country, 15 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, on D-Day. And that's 15 years before I'm born, Jess. So, the fact is that
all those places.
Yes, of course. I think the point I'm trying to make is that we have to be respectful of history, regardless of what the topic is. And in this case here, because it's a sport, and we don't hold it maybe in the same regard as we would a wartime effort, for sure, and nor should we. But having said that, from a sporting perspective, especially hockey, and especially in terms of professional hockey at the highest level, nothing was more impactful than the Summit Series in 1972. And to expand on that for you, the Summit Series was a month-long competition. Now, it's not that they went every day or every second day for 30 days. There was a 2-week break in between the 4 games in Canada and the 4 in the States. But what happened during that 2 weeks is Canada traveled overseas before they went to the Soviet Union and to Russia. They played 2 games against the Swedish national team. Then they continued the series against the Soviet national team. And then they wrapped it up by playing a game against the actual world champions at the time, the Czech national team. So there was Canada, Russia, Sweden, and the Czechs in meaningful contests. You would say meaningful, Liam, they were exhibition games. They didn't mean anything. Well, no, they meant a lot. There was nothing in the world previous in the sport of hockey that had the best players from Canada competing. Despite the fact that Bobby Orr was hurt and Bobby Hull wasn't allowed to play, we had the majority of our best players available. And the nature of how the tournament unfolded, from that shocking opening night loss in Montreal on September 2nd, 1972, through to not only the win 2 nights later in Toronto, the tie in Winnipeg 2 nights later, and then the loss again in Vancouver, which led to Phil Esposito's speech. And I'll tell you something right now, Jess, and now this is mostly a Canadian perspective, but Phil Esposito's speech on national TV to the late Johnny Eastaugh at the conclusion of Game 4 in Vancouver should be required viewing in Canadian schools. Now, the thing is that this series translated Canada. The entire Soviet Union shut down to watch the games in Russia as well. The entire hockey world, such as it was available to them at that time in 1972, were watching and waiting for the results of the Summit Series to hear how the Canadian pros were doing against these Soviet quote-unquote amateurs, which was one of the biggest jokes in the world at the time, as we all know in hindsight. But having said that, the nature of the series, with Canada being down after the 4 games, going to Sweden, having what transpired over there, going to the Soviet Union, losing the first game on September 22nd, Game 5, winning Game 6 on September 24th, winning Game 7 on September 26th, and then winning Game 8 to win the series on September 28th. Not only that, but winning Game 6, Game 7, and Game 8, all by 1 goal. Not only that, winning Game 6, Game 7, and Game 8 with the same man getting the game-winning goal in all 3 games. Paul Henderson, the game winner in Game 6, the game winner in Game 7 with 2 minutes and 6 seconds to play, beat every Russian on the ice, rooshed it over Vladislav Tretiak, supposed to be the greatest goalie in the world, according to some. What a freaking joke that is. Then you go to Game 8, and he gets the series and game winner in the most impactful month in the history of the sport of hockey, with 34 seconds to play in Game 8, culminating 27 days in September of 1972. Say, Liam, what's impactful about that? Easy. Why do you think the Swedes started coming to the WHA and the NHL? Because they were scouted in those 2 games that Canada played. Who were they? Boreas Salming, Inga Hammerstrom, Lars-Erik Sjoberg, Tommy Bergman. Like, wake up. Open up a freaking book. Do some goddamn research. This is the most impactful moment in the history of the sport. The most impactful month in the history of the sport. This dwarfs Eruzione in 1980. This dwarfs any other moment in Olympic or international hockey. And to further that, Jess, just to finish up here with the icing on the cake, for anybody who's going to have the temerity to actually sit down and find the video of the 3rd period of Game 8. This is what I challenge people. You started this question by saying, the majority of your listeners right now are not going to have been around to see it. I get that. So you know what? I would never say to anybody listening right now, I'm assuming they're hockey fans or sports fans that are listening to you, I would never say, watch all 8 games. No. I'm going to tell you this. If you're listening to this right now, and if you got the guts or the balls, just watch the third period of Game 8, September 28th, 1972. Canada is losing 5-3. By the way, I'll point something out, Jess, because you came from this great country of ours, which would be Canada. I'm in the States right now, but Canada, you know what I mean, north of the 49th. And fact is that Team Canada 72, that's the first time ever, any entity from our country, which has been around since 1867, anything was called Team Canada. Was Team Canada 1972 Summit Series. Now you can send over 15 chefs to try and win a cooking contest, and they're called Team Canada, which is great. I love it. Anything you put a flag on, I'm all in. But the fact is, the very first Team Canada ever was a Summit Series. So I challenge anybody who's listening right now who does not know anything about the Summit Series. You watch a third period of Game 8. You know what you're going to see, Jess? You're going to see Phil Esposito make it 5-4. Then you're going to see my favorite player of all time around the 10-minute mark, Yvon Cornway, make it 5-all. But you know what happened, Jess? The goal light didn't go on. You know why it didn't go on? Because the goal judges were paid by the Soviets. They didn't want Canada to win. Get into the officiating here in a second. Goal light didn't go on. Alan Eagleson, disposed now, but at the time he was a czar, and he stood up to complain. And as he was racing over to try and confront the goal judge, he was intercepted by the Soviet military who rang the arena. They circled the arena. And you know what they were carrying, Jess? They were carrying machine guns. And they were trying to cart off Alan Eagleson, the executive director of Hockey Night in Canada, of Team Canada, and they were trying to cart him off. And the Canadian players saw it, so they cleared the bench. At the 10-minute mark of Game 8, September 28, 1972, they cleared the bench, and Gary Bergman, the late Gary Bergman, and Pete Mahovlich went over the boards, and this is all on video. So please, people, if you weren't old enough, if you think that Sidney Crosby scored in overtime in Vancouver is even close, if you think Eruzione in 1980, which wasn't even a game that decided anything, was close, you watch the third period, and you watch Bergman and Pete Mahovlich going over the boards, swinging their sticks at military carrying machine guns. And tell me when there's anything in hockey that even rivaled this. Please, don't even friggin' go there. It's not even in the same stratosphere. And they rescued Alan Eagleson. They bring him back across the ice. And then with 3 minutes to go in a 5-all game, in Game 8, the Russians send down a message to the Canadian bench that they're going to declare victory because they had scored one more goal than us. And if you watch the video, the last face-off before the Henderson goal, there's a powwow. And Phil Esposito brings the guys together because he was the man. That's the greatest 20 minutes of hockey ever played by anybody who's ever worn skates in the history of mankind. Phil Esposito, third period, Game 8, 72. And if I have to say it again, September 28th. And which was a Thursday, by the way, in Canada. I don't know, probably Friday in Australia, I guess, but Thursday here. And Phil said to the guys, I'm not leaving the ice, and we're going to win this game. And the play went back and forth, and then Pete Mahovlich was coming back up. Paul Henderson was on the bench. He screamed at Pete. He wasn't even a coach, but Pete came off. Pete, if you ask Pete today, he doesn't know why he came off. He does not know. If you ask Paul today, he says he does not know why he yelled at Pete. He never did it before. He never did it since. Pete said, I never had any player yell at me to come off the ice. If they ever did, I would have told them to F off. I'll come off when I'm goddamn well ready. But he didn't. Paul yelled at him, and he went off. And when you hear that famous, iconic last few seconds of Foster Hewitt, who came out of retirement to do the play-by-play of the series on TV, and he says Henderson makes a wild stab for it and fell. He came off the bench and charged in the offensive zone. Yvon Cornway stayed on. It's fooled the Russians. It fooled them. And they ringed the puck around the boards, but it didn't clear the zone because Cornway was still there. He was a right-hand shot, and he's playing, he was a left-hand shot playing right wing, so he got it on his backhand. He flipped it over to his forehand, and he tried to hit Henderson on a one-timer coming in like a bullet off the bench, but he missed him. So Henderson makes a wild stab for it and fell. He falls behind the net. Puck comes off the boards, comes back. The Russian defenseman who handles the puck, for anybody who does take the time to watch it, his name was Yuri Lyapkin. He wore number 25. He was a right-hand shot. He was one of only 2 right-hand shots on the roster. He only had one other guy, number 16, Petrov. Lyapkin, if he had been a left-hand shot, it's an easy clear. But he's a right-hand shot, so he bobbled the puck. And it rolled off his stick right to Phil Esposito, who, like he said before the face-off, said he would not leave the ice. And he did not. And he chipped it back to the front of the net where Paul Henderson had hit the boards, got up, came to the front of the net, and there it is. The puck is there. And he takes a shot. And Tretiak saves it. And the puck comes right back on Paul's stick. And he buries it. 34 seconds to go. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Thursday, September 28, 1972. And the country went wild. And you can take your Crosby, and you can take your Ruzioni, and you can take your Darryl Sittler in 76, and you can take your Joe Sakic in 2002. You can take your Jonathan Toews in 2014. You can take Theo Fleury in 96, Steve Larmer 91, Mike Bossy 84, go down the line. And you can put them all together. And nothing ever in the history of mankind will rival the Summit Series in 1972 for impact, drama, and how it ended. And that's my story.
Interesting. What is Paul Henderson is specifically known for the 72 Summit Series comparatively to a lot of his teammates. Growing up, I didn't hear about him beyond the Summit Series compared to other guys that played for the team. Was he not as well known, or is it just because his name became entrenched with those goals that you don't tend to hear about him during more of his playing career?
But you got to be older. Yeah, like you have to be in terms of knowing Paul before 72. You have to be of a certain age, and this in this case here would be no knock on anybody listening who may be younger. And not that I was knocking them earlier, Jess. I was just saying, you know, if anybody listening to this calls themselves a hockey fan and they want to know about impact, then learn a little bit about the Summit Series. In terms of Paul Henderson, I mean, this guy was a Memorial Cup winner with Hamilton. The next year after the Memorial Cup, he led the OHA in goal scoring. And then, you know, he was Detroit Red Wing property, and he went to the Red Wings, and very quickly in 2 out of his first 3 years, he's in the Stanley Cup Finals. And he was, the second of the 2 years, he was the number 1 left winger on the team. And, you know, he was involved in one of the biggest trades in hockey history on March 3rd, 1968, the Frank Mahovlich trade. Ullman, Henderson, and Smith, Normie Ullman, Paul Henderson, and Floyd Smith were traded from the Detroit Red Wings to the Toronto Maple Leafs for Frank Mahovlich, Pete Stemkowski, Gary Unger, and the amateur rights for Carl Brewer. And that was March 3rd, 1968. So he became a Toronto Maple Leaf. And he was played on the number 1 line for the Toronto Maple Leafs for his tenure there. He was a left winger. And he played with Normie Ullman and Ronnie Ellis. They were a line. They were outstanding. I mean, the Leafs weren't very good after they won that cup in 67. They slid off the rails pretty quickly. That's a whole other story for another time. But Paul was outstanding for them. And, he got selected for Team Canada. I mean, they picked 35 guys. They picked the top 35 Canadians. He was one of them. He was coming off a 38-goal season, not too shabby. And, he was the last player in the original 6 era to have a 4-goal game, which he did for the Detroit Red Wings. And, the guy played over 1,000 games pro, over 700 points, had 7 20-goal seasons, played in NHL All-Star games, Stanley Cup Finals. What he did for Team Canada 72 is all aside from that. So won a Memorial Cup and led the O in goals. So, I think he had a very solid hockey career. It certainly is lesser than many of his peers, but it's certainly better than many as well. And, that would be the history of Paul aside from 1972.
Okay. I reckon we probably spent about a half hour just talking about the Summit Series. So let's talk about a couple of the other moments. I mean, do you have a 1, 2, and 3?
Well, where you run into very quickly is where you grade international moments. And don't get me wrong, Sid's goal and Eruzione's goal are absolutely monstrous. And I mean, in Eruzione's case, Miracle on Ice, beating the Russians in February 1980. To me, that's the single one-game greatest upset in sports history. Like, forget about hockey.
I was going to assume Miracle on Ice is number 2. That's sort of where I would have placed that.
Yeah. I'd have to place it like a 2 and a 2A, because I think Sid's goal rivals Eruzione's in my view, because Eruzione's was culminating such an upset, but Crosby's. But the fact is that it didn't win the gold. It just got them to the gold medal game. They still had to beat the Finns, and it was a one-game shocker. And I think you got to give credit where it's due. So to me, you got Paul, and then if you wanted to say Eruzione, I would say, okay, right on, that's cool. And if somebody else listening wanted to say Sid, I would go, okay, right on, that's cool. To me, they're tied. I got them at 2 and 2A basically, and then you see right now my trend right now is international. I mean, you get in the NHL.
These are national team things. So, can we take it there? Is there one I guess NHL or NHL sort of period moment that you have in mind?
Well, I think Bobby Orr's goal in 1970 stands the test of time there. I mean, the Bruins hadn't won the Cup since 1941. And it was Mother's Day, May 10th, 1970. And of all people, Bobby scores in overtime. And so I think because I consider him the greatest player ever to wear skates, he scores that winner. He does it in dramatic fashion. Obviously the photo, I mean, it's not so much that the goal was the greatest goal of all time.
He takes iconic where he's Superman through.
Exactly. But I think it carries weight, because it was in overtime. Boston hadn't won the Cup since 41, or only won 2 Cups. It was his first of 2, and he did it in such dramatic fashion. So I think by NHL standards, there's no comparison. I think it stands alone as I feel Paul Henderson's moment does in 72. So from an NHL perspective, and exactly that's, I can say that, and I know others do it as well, because when we went at the turn of the century from 1999 to 2000, Henderson's goal was voted the number 1 goal by the IIHF as the number 1 goal in international hockey history. And in the NHL, they voted Bobby Orr's goal in 1970 as the number 1 goal in NHL history. So I'm of the same mindset. I feel both of those are standalones in international and NHL moments. And I don't think anything is even remotely close to either, to be honest with you.
Okay. I'll segue, and I want to take this conversation somewhere else. A few, probably only maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I finally sat down and watched the Gordie Howe story with I think it's a made-for-television movie about him going back to play with his sons. And it sort of got me thinking because, again, people my age and younger, we don't think about anything besides pre-NHL. People that are 30 and younger, it's dominated by American teams these days, and we don't think of anything before that. Do you want to just tell us, before the NHL became the predominant thing, tell us a little bit about the formation of the WHA, the NHL, the rivalry, and how those guys were forced to come together?
Well, you had, what you had is you had some well-endowed, well-resourced businessmen in the early 70s who wanted to form their own league. They felt that there was an opportunity, and there was a glut of players, they felt, and that if they could woo a couple of superstars over, that they'd be able to possibly get something off the ground. So, I mean, Mr. Hunter, Mr. Haskins, Dennis Murphy, go down the line. There are 3 or 4 guys that kind of spearheaded the whole thing, but it really all stopped and started with the Winnipeg Jets being able to coerce Bobby Hull to come, and the World Hockey Association after about 12 months of desk work and paperwork and behind the scenes work, began in fruition. And the franchises went as fast as they came. The league lasted for 7 years. There were 26 franchises in total, of which a number did never even saw the light of day, never saw the ice. But having said that, they created a pretty significant niche for themselves, and so much so that a number of Hall of Famers either finished their career in that league, or started their careers in that league, like Mark Messier and Wayne Gretzky, and Michel Goulet, and numerous others. And as we know, numerous others went into that league after Bobby Hull and Hall of Famers and played there. So that's the World Hockey Association. I mean, it lasted for 7 years, 72 to 79. And,
It gave us the Oilers effectively, didn't it?
It gave us the Edmonton Oilers. They were originally called the Alberta Oilers, and then they became the Edmonton Oilers. And it gave us when those four teams merged from the WHA in 1979 for the 79-80 season. I mean, it gave us those four teams, and that was the Winnipeg Jets who later moved, and the Quebec Nordiques who later moved, and the Hartford Whalers who later moved, and the Edmonton Oilers. So, three left. I mean, you could say in a roundabout way Winnipeg came back, but it wasn't the same franchise. But having said that, at least there's a Jet team back in Winnipeg, and the only team that remains standing from that merger are the Edmonton Oilers. But it still was a brokered deal. The NHL still, even in that season with the WHA disbanded, still screwed them over. Like, they didn't allow Wayne Gretzky to win the Rookie of the Year because they said he played in a pro league. And then the next season they allowed Peter Stastny at 25 years of age with the Quebec Nordiques, who had played 7 years pro in the Czech, with the Czech national team in the Czech league, win the Calder Trophy. So it was just another slap in the face to the WHA, and they did their best to try and continue to just downplay their existence years later. But the fact remains is that the Winnipeg Jets gave us Hedberg, Nielsen, and Hull. You had the Indianapolis Racers, and then the Edmonton Oilers gave us Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier. You had Gordie Howe playing in Houston, and then New England, and then obviously Hartford. And you had Bobby Hull with the Winnipeg Jets before he came back in the NHL as well. So, you had a number of stories. And, here I am, a published author, 4 books in. And my 4th book I wrote on Goldie Goldthorpe, who played for 4 teams in the WHA. So, it was a league that gave a lot of players an opportunity who would not have got it had there just strictly been an NHL. At least not have got it at that level. Because at WHA, the other thing, Jess, it should be pointed out, is that it immediately almost tripled everybody's salary at the highest levels. So Paul Henderson tells a great story. We were talking about him just a few minutes ago. He jumped from the Toronto Maple Leafs. One of the reasons he is blackballed from the Hockey Hall of Fame, because Jim Gregory, the late Jim Gregory, was the general manager of the Leafs at the time and became then a de facto head honcho of the Hall of Fame, said, "Paul will never get in over my dead body." Jim is dead now, so we'll see if Paul can get in. But having said that, Paul told me that he made $25,000 in 1973 with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the next year with the Toronto Toros, they paid him $75,000. You want to think about that? Just think about in 1973, how much of an increase in pay, what that meant. Paul had 3 young daughters at home at that time. Just imagine what that did for his family. So, and that was absolutely widespread across the board. So, if you or I had have been there at that time and somebody threw that kind of money in front of us, we would have gone. Now, having said that, not everybody did. They threw a lot of money at guys like Guy Lafleur and Gilbert Perreault and a number of others, but they didn't go. They didn't go. So not everybody went. And but I think a lot of the guys who felt maybe they were either borderline to make big bucks took an opportunity and said, "You know what? I'll go try it. And if the whole thing blows up, maybe I can come back and play in the show." But that's the way that went.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. I think, just for the purposes of running in time on everything, I think, as I said, I'd like to speak to you more, and we'll probably have at least a few more podcasts to delve quite a lot further into particular topics like the greatest players and what makes them there. But just in terms of trying to, keep us to maybe no more than 20 minutes from now, then why don't, is there a particular, I can mention anything, but is there anything else that's sort of on your mind at the moment, or issues that you want to talk about in particular?
Well, I guess the burning question today that does bring hockey fans of all ages in is the greatest goal scorer because of what Ovi's doing. And even the bars I was at tonight, because I was with a bunch of hockey guys, as our event got canceled here, as you know, some of the guys are still floating around. So we were out having a few beverages, and that conversation came up again, and these are guys who played in the NHL, and we're having a discussion about it. So I think in the case of Alexander Ovechkin, in my estimation, Jess, I think he's the greatest one-dimensional goal scorer in NHL history. I think Wayne still holds the mantle only because he scored 92. He had 4 consecutive 70-goal seasons. He scored 50 and 39, and he's at 894. So he's got all those marks. And I understand the disparity in the game, notwithstanding the fact that Ovi is playing in an era with no red line, 3-on-3 OT, and obviously a much differently officiated game. And you can go back in the 80s and say Wayne played, the goaltenders were inferior, and the style of hockey was more conducive to scoring. And it was. Statistically, it backs that up. But I think Ovi is the greatest one-dimensional scorer of all time. I think Wayne still holds the mantra of the greatest goal scorer because you can't go against the numbers. But Ovi is the greatest one-dimensional goal scorer of all time. And that's significant for me to say because my answer up until the season was Mike Bossy. But I gave away to Ovi after what he's done month after month, notwithstanding now the fact that we're in hiatus. But well. Yeah. I mean, he's 34. He's going to be 35 next year. And I don't think he'll beat Wayne, but I do think that he deserves every accolade he gets. He is absolutely just a freak of nature. He is. And I think at some point why I think he trumps the other one-dimensional goal scorers that people may nominate, like a Brett Hull, like a Mike Bossy, others in that ilk. And we can't really, as much as I love the history of the game, I can't really go back to the Joe Malones. He would be the guy. I mean, from the 1910s and 1920s, Joe would be your guy. 1930s, you got Charlie Conacher. 1940s and 50s, you got Rocket Richard and Gordie Howe. 1960s, Bobby Hull. 1970s, Guy Lafleur. And then you're in the 80s very quickly. And you got to go Wayne, and with honorable mention to Mario, who was right there as well, and obviously in the 70s, Lafleur gave way to Bossy, so Bossy would be the guy because he translated, he transferred over the 70s and the 80s, and he was a better goal scorer than Guy Lafleur was. So, in my opinion, but it's a great debate. It's a lot of fun, especially if you're sitting down just drilling back a bunch of pints with some friends and get into it. If people can speak to it a little bit with some background, as if they've done some homework. If you're just just an absolute blind fan of Ovi and you're unwilling to look at any other name or stat, well, sadly, that's what Twitter is.
Well, you mentioned rule changes. You said no red line. Can you just clarify that and a few other things that you think have made the game different in the modern era?
Well, I mean, with the red line coming out, people obviously wouldn't know they're listening to your show right now, but there was no red line in the NHL when the NHL started in 1917. They put the red line in 1943, essentially at that time to speed up the game, ironically, because the nature of how the game was being played is players were carrying the puck because they had to carry it across both lines. And then even when they changed that rule and you could pass it across both lines. Then you had the offside came in at 29-30. They put the red line in to allow defensemen to pass the puck up to the halfway mark of the ice, so they didn't have to carry to the blue line and the first blue line. And they said it'll speed up the game, which is so ironic compared to why they took it out. But I think the red line being out in the modern era is obviously a huge advantage and we just take it for granted now. We really do. But the fact is that if can you imagine Guy Lafleur with no red line or Yvon Cornway, some of the speedsters back in the day, Dave Keon, Toronto Maple Leafs, my God. There was so many guys who are so fast. I can think of so many, even lesser lights on teams like a Juha Whiting or, a Russ Courtnall. These guys who played 70s and 80s and into the 90s who were so liquid, fast, grease lightning, and what they could do. Bobby Orr passing a puck with no red line. He could fire the fall blue. Point is that it all equals out. And these nerds, these stats guys who get in and go, and start going like, get a number for projected goals based on whatever. You know what? At the end of the day, there's a number, and it is what it is. And Rocket Richard was the first to 500, and now there's been 45 guys to score 500 goals. So does that diminish what the Rocket did because he ended up with 544? I don't think so. Doesn't diminish it at all if you know your history. He did it in less than 1,000 games. Everything else he did in hockey, to me, was so significant. He had 18 game-winning goals in the playoffs. He had 7 hat tricks in the playoffs. He had 6 overtime goals in the playoffs. That record stood for 36 years before Joe Sakic broke it. And Joe Sakic broke it playing a ton more games than Rocket Richard did. There's a reason why the trophy is named after him. Did Bobby Hull do more as a goal scorer? He did. Statistically, he did. But the Rocket, all in, when you factor in the playoffs, let's put it this way, Jess. This is just my opinion. Let's put it this way. You need a goal scored. You're in the game of your life, and you need a goal scored. You can pick anybody from any era, and you need a goal scored like next shift. You're tapping Rocket Richard on the shoulder. That's who you want out there, because he is going to score or he's going to kill 2 men in the process. It's one of 2 ways. And as good as Ovi is, Rocket, I think his statistics in the playoffs are what set him apart from a goal scoring perspective.
Let's what I'd like to do, because you wanted to take this to most important players, because I assume every time you're making a public appearance, this is what comes up. So you've talked about you've taken the Ovechkin route and talking about how he's one-dimensional, just being able to score goals. You then talked about Gretzky in points totals. Obviously, we know that he's more all-rounded. His assist numbers are up there as well. Can you give some context around the playing styles and how you mention these guys? Because growing up, when I was still a kid, Lemieux was young enough before he got struck by cancer or anything that people at the time were telling me this guy is better than Gretzky. When Gretzky put the numbers up, I would still hear from older people that he wasn't as good as Gordie Howe. Nowadays, Crosby's sort of by the wayside, and I'm hearing all about McDavid. When you sort of talk about the top sort of 5 guys who are in this discussion, your opinion, because it comes down to games played, not only just goals, but overall impact and success on the team, their ability to contribute through assists and playmaking, how do you overall rank them when it's not just about goals scored?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll give you my answer. I have it at, first of all, my top 5 are Bobby Orr, Wayne Gretzky, Gordie Howe, Mario Lemieux, and Sidney Crosby. Those are my top 5 all-time NHL players. And the way I answer that is this. The greatest offensive player combined with longevity in NHL history is Gordie Howe. And the statistic that backs that up is he was in the top 5, not the top 10, but the top 5 in scoring for 20 consecutive years. 1949 to 1969. Nobody has matched that. Nobody ever will match that. Gordie Howe has the combination of excellence and longevity. Wayne Gretzky is the greatest offensive force in the history of sports, in my estimation. He's got more assists than any other player in history has points. And his stat that backs that up is Wayne Gretzky finished 65 points or more up to 79 points ahead of the second place scorer in the league for 6 consecutive seasons. Unmatched, unheard of, unparalleled. Bobby Orr is the greatest player ever to wear skates in the history of the sport of hockey. Now, his stats to back that up, he's the first defenseman in NHL history to record 100 points. He's the first player in NHL history to record 6 consecutive 100-point seasons. He's the first and only defenseman to lead the league in scoring, which he did twice. And in 1971, he was plus 124. A good season today for somebody is plus 35. Okay?
That's better than Detroit at the moment, isn't it?
That's better than probably 90% of the teams in the league. Yeah. He was plus 124 in 1971. He also won the Norris Trophy for 8 consecutive years. Bobby Orr revolutionized the game. His position and how it was played, he did it differently and created an entire genre of players as defensemen. And he additionally was able to funnel his incredible talent and competitiveness and offensive instincts he channeled that into some of the most incredible moments in hockey history, being the 70 Stanley Cup, the overtime winner. He also got the Stanley Cup winner for Boston in 1972 on a shot from the point against Eddie Jackman in Game 6. And then he was MVP of the first Canada Cup in 1976 that he played on one leg. And he tied for the scoring lead with Denny Potvin on Team Canada. I think they finished 1 point out of first with Milan Novi in the Czechoslovakia at the time. But Bobby Orr, to me, overall, is the greatest player. Mario Lemieux, my number 4 choice, is the greatest individual talent in NHL history. I've never seen a man. Now, I don't have a stat to quantify this because the people who say that had Mario stayed healthy and not been stricken with cancer or not had the back injuries or not retired initially because he was fed up with the league and the hooking and the holding obstruction, that he would have beat, surpassed, or done whatever to Wayne's numbers. They may very well be right. You may very well be right. And I would hearken that debate to the Mike Bossy and Alexander Ovechkin one, because Mike Bossy played 10 years and then his back gave way and he had to retire. And in 9 of those years consecutively, he scored 50 goals. And for a lot of people, that was enough for them to hang their hat on. But I feel right now that Alexander Ovechkin, 15 years in, deserves the accolades and to be considered superior to Mike Bossy career as a goal scorer because he did it for 15 and Mike did it for 9 and change. And I think you have to at some point give credence to longevity as an excellence. And Wayne Gretzky had that over Mario Lemieux. Mario Lemieux did not make the playoffs until his 5th year in the NHL. Mario Lemieux, by his own admission, will tell anybody and everybody that the defining moment of his hockey career was playing with Wayne Gretzky in the 1987 Canada Cup when he finally found out and saw with his own eyes and was able to absorb what you had to do to be a true superstar in the game. He was blown away by Wayne's work ethic. He was blown away by seeing a superstar who was racking up 200 points every year. Wayne Gretzky had 15 100-point seasons and 4 200-point seasons in 20 years. Give me a break. Mario is not Wayne. Mario is number 4. And for anybody to suggest that he should be ranked higher simply because of projection or because he was better individually, you don't know a damn thing about the sport. It is Bobby, Wayne, Gordie, Mario, and I now have Sid number 5 ahead of who I had number 5 for years, who was Rocket Richard. And I have moved Sid ahead because if you cannot, as either a historian or consider yourself an expert of the game, which I do, nobody watches more hockey than me. Nobody. And I consider myself an authority of the game. If you cannot allow yourself the opportunity to move current people, whether it be this decade, the decade past, or the one before, into the lexicon or the discussion of the greats that went before us, then you do a disservice to yourself and to anybody who would follow you or listen or read you as somebody who considers to be an authority of the game. Because occasionally people come along who have to be regarded as a little bit better. And I got Sid right now overall as a better hockey player than Rocket Richard from a career point of view. And the 2 Stanley Cups back-to-back and the back-to-back Conn Smythes after what he's done throughout his life, to me, cemented that. And believe me, I interviewed Rocket Richard in 1989. It's one of the highlights of my life. And I went to his funeral. I went to his wake with my mother because she grew up in Quebec idolizing him. And, I say this with the absolute more respect than anybody who thinks that I'm not by moving Sid ahead. But to me, Sid is now in my number 5 hole. And that's my top 5.
Okay. I just want to talk about that era a little bit more because when you mentioned Gretzky, Lemieux, that this is their later period is my sort of hockey heyday. Those are the memories I remember as sort of an early teen growing up. And I think it might have been an interview that I saw with Theoren Fleury when he was on the Strombo show or something. And his argument was, he said, this is the key. He reckons that is the period of hockey. You go back much further, and I'm sure that you may argue against that. But this sort of period of the early to mid 90s when you had Gretzky, Lemieux, Sakic, Chelios, Hull, Fleury, Modano playing, that I still haven't seen anything like that in my lifetime, although I'm not 40 yet. Do you think that was a great era, or how do you sort of combine that? Because we still had fighting. We still had guys, individuals putting up amazing numbers before you sort of hear that, 2005 and after that, the game starts getting a little bit more diluted and all these changes start getting introduced.
Well, I just really firmly believe that every era produced great players. And I don't know of any era where I couldn't name 5, 6, 7 guys. I mean, I want to talk about the 1960s. Went in with Boom Boom Geoffrion and Bobby Hull scoring 50 goals back-to-back years. Becoming the second and third guys to have 50-goal seasons was such a monstrous thing. You had Jean Beliveau in his prime. You had the emergence of Stan Mikita. You had Dave Keon coming into Toronto. You still had Gordie Howe, won his 6th Art Ross Trophy in 1963. You had Alex Delvecchio. You had Pierre Pilote win 3 straight Norris trophies. You had Red Kelly, who went from defense to center, was outstanding. The Leafs won those 3 cups in a row in 62, 63, 64. That's just the 60s. I can do that for every decade. I think it really goes back to what I've said kind of a couple times over this, Jess, is that to be fair, you got to go back over every era and give it its due. If you want to talk the 1930s, you got Eddie Shore and Howie Morenz. You got Cy Denneny. You got Frank Niber. You got that's more 20s with Frank, but I mean you got the Cook brothers, Bill and Bun. You got Charlie Conacher, who led the league in scoring, Stanley Cup winner. The Kid line with Toronto. You got the Dynamite line in Boston. You got Morenz, Joliet, and Gagnon in Montreal. You got the S line in the Montreal Maroons. Jesus, you got that's just the 20s and the 30s. You want to go back? You got Joe Malone. I mean, holy lifting. You get in the 40s, you got Rocket Richard and Gordie Howe. Rocket Richard basically breaking in 43 full-time. Gordie Howe, 46. I don't know, man. How are you beating Rocket Richard and Gordie Howe? How are you beating that? You're not beating that with Joe Sakic and Mike Modano. Believe me, you're not. You're not. Like, if you're going to give history its due, You were talking about two of the greatest players of all time played the same position, were rivals for 15 years, played against each other in the playoffs numerous times, fought each other 3 times. I mean, Wayne and Mario are in that discussion, but not Sakic and Modano and Jagger even, or, Jagger's close for sure. He's in the discussion. But I mean, every era. You could say that about every era. It really could. I mean, you want to bring in Ted Lindsay in the 1940s. I mean, he's a scoring champion. And what he played, it was such a different era. I mean, you had to have guts to put a sweater on at that time. Not that you did in the 90s, but if you could get away with it. You didn't have to fight. Joe Sakic didn't have to fight. Mike McDaniel didn't have to fight. Gordie Howe had to fight. Rocket Richard had to fight. Eddie Shore had to fight. Howie Morenz fought. There were a lot of guys back then.
That was intrinsic to the game back then.
What's that?
That was fighting was intrinsic to the game back then.
Absolutely. It wasn't this pussy shit you got today. That's for sure.
Well, let's talk about that. Both in separate interviews I've seen, both Bobby Orr and Gretzky have talked about how creativity is gone from the modern game. And I have seen numerous separate interviews talking about the necessity of fighting in hockey and how they're trying to stamp that out. How do you, well, you've already given me your view on the modern game. I'll ask you to expand on that.
Yeah, I was a little harsh, so I'm going to take the 10-second take back on that.
10 minutes ago, you told every Lemieux lover to go to hell, effectively. So I think we're
no, man.
Digging a few holes here.
Hey, look, there's been 8,000 players and change to play one game in the NHL since 1917. I got Mario ranked number 4. I think that's pretty good. I mean, the guy won 2 Stanley Cups. It's not like he won 11 like Henri Richard. I mean, he was, a multiple Art Ross and Hart Trophy winner, and obviously did what he did in some international events. But I mean, he took a lot of international events off. Wayne never did. Wayne never turned down his country ever. And everything Mario did, Wayne did better. So I don't, the only argument with Mario is all projection. It's all projection. He had 199 points. He had stayed healthy. He would have outscored Wayne. Yeah, but he didn't. But he went 46 games in a row for scoring a point. Wayne went 51. If he hadn't hurt his back, he would have done.
All right.
But he didn't. Like, give me a goddamn break. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I love the guy. You kidding? When he rifled that goal in on September 15th, 87, nobody jumped more than me. But at the end of the day, he's not Wayne. He's not. He can try all he wants. He's taller, but he's not Wayne. And
all right, my actual question was creativity in modern hockey and the lack of fighting today.
Yeah, all right, brother. Well, first of all, lack of fighting. I mean, fighting's gone. I mean, it's we've got a little bit of a rush here in the last 4 or 5 weeks. Had a bunch of guys dropping the gloves for the first time this year because all the heightened awareness as playoff pushes are on and stuff. So there's a lot more tension on the ice. So you get that. But fighting's at an all-time low. It's the lowest it's ever been, and it'll continue to drop. I pray to God that the NHL doesn't attach a game misconduct to a fighting major. I don't believe they will, because I think the NHLPA want it to remain part of the game, and I do believe that the Board of Governors, which are the owners, mostly I think still do as well. So I think, I hope, I pray throughout my lifetime that I never see a game misconduct that accompany a 5-minute major in the National Hockey League. Having said that, you touched on it just a few minutes ago. It was certainly an intrinsic part of the game in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. What it was prior to that was not so much an intrinsic part of the game as much as it was a regular response to egregious acts on the ice. But it didn't, what you had in the 70s with the Broad Street Bullies, and here I am in Philly talking about this was going to be our highlight tomorrow night on stage, was, in the 70s, and then what that begat in the 80s and 90s was a style and a tip and a style of, not only a style of game, but a specific type of player that came into the game that was singularly there for that role. That player no longer exists in today's game, and that player did not exist in the game prior to 1970 either. Well, people will say, well, what about Reggie Fleming? What about Howie Young? What about Lou Fontinato? go down the line. And I would strenuously and strongly disagree and be ready to debate and argue with any of them on those points. I mean, Howie Young was a psycho. There's no doubt about it. But he would be the only guy that I may be willing. He led the NHL in penalty minutes in 1963. He had 273 minutes. He set a record at that time with Detroit. But he had he had mental health issues, and he's no longer with us. But he wasn't only just tough. He was absolutely psychotic. And there's a difference. He wasn't just so much there to champion the role as he was just to lose his mind, because he just was absolutely flat out crazy. The other guys, played a key role, man, and either won Stanley Cups or played in finals and played significant minutes on their team, whoever they may be. And I include guys like Ted Lindsay in that discussion and numerous others. So, but fighting today is to me, it's a non-entity. I mean, that was the last game in the NHL last night, as we're taping this, Jess, was the Ottawa Senators and the Los Angeles Kings, and Colin White of the Ottawa Senators had his first fight ever in his NHL career. And a little badge of honor for him. I think saw in the comments after, and he got a lot of accolades from his teammates. And I think it's still allowed. And, because of that, I think men, you can't even say that so much these days without getting vilified, it seems. But men who play the sport still sometimes, on occasion, a collision sport where you're skating 30 miles an hour with blades on your feet, carrying weapons, playing with so much on the line in terms of big business and the magnitude of everything, can still carry bad intentions. And maybe you just might want to punch somebody in the head. And it seems like you're such a Neanderthal for saying that. But I say to people, did you never go to a dance when you were 22 or 23 with your buds and maybe something happened? Like, were you just tied into a laptop your whole goddamn life? Like, did you never get out and have to ever back up family or friend or a wife or a girlfriend? Or were you just a shrinking violet your entire life, unable to process any type of physical response? I don't get it. I don't get how people don't understand how these are alpha males, primarily in their 20s, in unbelievable physical condition, and they still, and it's at an all-time low. And yet you still have the left-wing socialist gutless pukes, going on Twitter, social media, crying. They're crying. You can see the tears. You can see the tears coming out of their eyes. Oh my God. Johnny threw a right hand and hit that man in the head. Oh my God. He's going to have multiple concussions. He's ruined for life. Like, it just absolutely makes me shake my head. But, not only am I old, Jess, but I'm old school. And,
I'll tell you what I'm liking best about this, Liam. I am so glad that I got you on a day off after about 7 beers at 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
This is gold.
Put a 1 in front of that 7, brother.
Let's I want to start winding it down. As I said, there are many other questions I'd like to ask you in a part 2, 3, and 4 as we get forward into the months. But there's a couple of players that I particularly want to mention and just get your thoughts on them, because you've mentioned a couple of them. Guy Lafleur has got.
You hear that? That's number 18.
Very good. Guy Lafleur, you've already mentioned him probably about 6 or 7 times in this podcast.
Love him.
When I was growing up, he was one of the last guys who was still playing without a helmet, whose impact was sort of, I remember when I was a kid, 8 or 9, there's how you should have seen him 10 years ago, that sort of thing. But what did you think about, because he was one of the big guys who switched. He went from the Habs to the Nordiques. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And did that mean anything to you as a fan or to Habs fans?
Yeah, well, Guy's whole career obviously encompassed my youth. He was drafted first overall in 71. I was 12. And, he had a very auspicious start, 29 goals his first year, 28 his second, and 21 his third. So he was regressing, and it wasn't good. But that second season, they won the Stanley Cup, and he played basically on Montreal's third line. and they only lost 10 games that year. They had 11 Hall of Famers on that roster. It was ridiculous. That's the most ever, by the way, in any Stanley Cup winning team, the 73 Habs. And Guy was a part of it, wearing a helmet, and really not a factor in the big picture. But you know, at the conclusion of the 73-74 season, his third year, when he scored 21 goals, three things happened. Number one, he got engaged, and his wife, Lise, her father was a minority owner of the Quebec Nordiques in the WHA, and wanted Guy to come to Quebec. And Guy seriously considered it because he played junior in Quebec and he loved the city. He would leave a Montreal practice in the early 1970s and drive to Quebec City to get a haircut, and then come back. That's how much he missed the city. So the fact that he turned his future father-in-law down was a pretty significant moment. The second thing was Sam Pollock realized that, and this is where you got to give Sam a lot of credit. Sam became a GM of the Habs in '63, taking over for Frank Selke Sr., and this is 11 years later. And you could say he made the shrewd trades that allowed him to get the draft pick to draft Lafleur. I'd go one better than that and say the biggest move he made was signing Lafleur that 5-year deal in '74 and getting him under contract. And then Guy just decided to take the helmet off. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time because the majority of the league weren't wearing a helmet. And he was, by the way, that bucket he wore was brutal. It was a brutal lid, man. It was a brutal lid. And he took it off. And of course, the rest is history. The hair flew. He flew. He scored his first of 50. And he was married then when the season started, and he had the new contract, and he just played like with an anvil off his shoulders, and he took off. And I'll tell you what, Jess, I mean, I was at the Montreal Forum 344 times in 21 years, from May 1, 75 to Monday night, March 11, 96, the final game ever at the Forum. 78 of those games were playoff games. And I was there May 10, 79, Thursday night against the Bruins, too many men on the ice. I was there with my late dad, Noel Patrick Maguire from Dublin, Ireland. And when Lafleur scored to tie that game at 4 on the power play for too many men on the ice, that railing shook. As God is my witness, that railing shook. We had standing room only behind the Reds, and the railing shook in my hands. That's how loud it was. It's the loudest I've ever heard a building to this day. It's the most emotion I've ever heard, and they still hadn't won. Lambert scored in overtime, the 9-minute, 33-second mark, and it was almost anticlimactic. It was a huge cheer and a big sigh of relief, but it wasn't like Lafleur scoring. And Dick Irvin, you know, who's still alive, God love him. He's like an uncle to me, a longtime broadcaster, Hockey Night in Canada and the Montreal Canadiens, and his dad coached the Habs longer than anybody, said to me, there was just a different feel, a different vibe, a different cheer in the crowd when Lafleur scored. And, you know, when 1977, when the Habs only lost 8 games, Guy was their guy. He had 6 straight 50-goal seasons. He did it with 3 centermen, Pete Mahovlich, Jacques Lemaire, Pierre LaRouche. And then, eventually every dog has their day, right? And things went sideways. I can get into the whole thing. I'm not going to go on all that. But he ended up retiring prematurely in November of '84. And then 3 years later, he comes back with the New York Rangers. And Phil Esposito, that was all Phil Esposito orchestrated. And he played with the Rangers, and then he left them and went and played 2 years with the Quebec Nordiques. And he came back to Montreal for the first time as a member of the Quebec Nordiques, and as a member of the New York Rangers even before that. And he scored 2 goals in the game. It was unbelievable. And he scored when he came back as a Nord as well. It's incredible stuff. And that's it, you know. And then he retired after his 2 years. And Nords had a great ceremony both in Montreal and the next night in Quebec. And he's a dear friend, and I know everything about him. But I mean, regardless of that, whatever, who cares? The fact is, he's a friend, and you know, he's gone through some pretty serious health issues the last 6 months, and I'm very happy to say that he's doing extremely well. He had a quadruple bypass, and then they found a spot on his lung, cancerous, and they removed it as well about 6 weeks later after the quadruple bypass. Imagine. But he's doing great, and he's the most electrifying player that I ever saw in my life. I'll say that much, Jess. He's the most electrifying player. I used to go to the Forum in the 70s on a Saturday night, and drink 100 beers and watch those games. Just watch Guy. And the Habs would win, of course, 99% of the time. And I'd be walking out of the building. I'd run my hands along the walls inside and just to try and get even more of the feel. And then I would see a little cubby hole, the old Forum. And I would say, I wonder if I could hide there. If I just deke out quickly out of the crowd, I could hide there and just wait for practice the next day, I mean, I was 17, 16, 17, 18 as a kid, as a snot-nosed punk kid. And it just meant so much to me, man. It meant so much to me. The building, the team, guys like Lafleur, Yvon Cornway, my favorite player of all time.
So you're a hockey historian, but you're a Habs fanatic then, aren't you?
Yeah, the Habs are my team. I mean, I proposed at center ice in the Montreal Forum. I'm the only guy ever to do it. Only guy. 71 years, 3 months, 17 days. That building was open for hockey in the NHL. And I'm the only man to propose at center ice Friday night, September 10th, 1993, 7:35 p.m. The building completely empty and every single light on. I'm the only guy.
Fantastic. I will ask you about another guy. I will ask you about a guy who is top 100 player, doesn't get mentioned above all the greats. Didn't think of him that much while he was in his career, but when I've gone back to watch his highlights, I'm more impressed now. Denis Savard, especially with things like the Denis Savard spin. I've started a couple of years ago going back and looking at what he did, and it was creativity pops out to me again when you talk about the fact that this doesn't exist anymore. He seemed to do his best work with the Blackhawks, and then was started falling down when he came over to the Habs. But man, there was some interesting stuff coming out of him about skating for a smaller guy and being able to produce.
Well, he's part of the greatest anecdote in hockey history. Did you know that? Yeah.
I did not.
So, have you ever heard of Les Trois Denis?
No.
Okay. So
the three Denis?
Are you familiar with the story? Okay.
No.
So Denis Savard played junior for the Montreal Junior Canadiens. Okay. He had two line mates named Denis Cyr and Denis Tremblay. All three guys from the province of Quebec played for the Montreal Junior Canadiens, all had the same first name. All of them were born in the same year, 1961. All of them were born in the same month, February. All of them were born on the same day, February 4th. February 4th, 1961, right. Les Trois Denis. It's the greatest anecdote in hockey history. Denis Savard went on to the NHL, of course, snubbed by the Habs when a huge mistake they made on draft day. They took Doug Wickenheiser, number 1. Babbage went second. Savard went third to Chicago. And on opening night that year in October of 1980, I was there, one of my 344 games. And not only did Chicago beat Montreal, but the Habs did not dress Doug Wickenheiser, and Denis Savard was the second star of the game. You want to talk about, I was probably about the one time when I was walking out, well, it wouldn't have been the only time, but it was one time anyway where I wanted to punch everything. And that was pretty frustrating. Denis Savard went on to have, obviously, a Hall of Fame career with the Chicago Blackhawks. He played on a line with Steve Larmer and Al Secord. He helped Al Secord to a 50-goal season, which is another anecdote because Al Secord became the last man in NHL history to record 50 goals and not wear a helmet. He was the last guy to do so. And he played on a line with Denis Savard and Steve Larmer at that time. When Savard was traded to Montreal in 91, his career was winding down. So most people thought. It was a Chris Chelios trade. It was panned. Chicago went to the finals in 91-92. Chelios took bad penalty after bad penalty after bad penalty. Not to say it cost Chicago the cup. I don't think they would have beat Pittsburgh anyway. But Denis Savard played 3 years and change in Montreal and averaged almost a point a game. And so much so that when they won the Cup in 93, in Game 1 against LA, Savard broke his foot, so he was forced out of the lineup. He got a playing cast on it, and by Game 5, he had the green light from the doctors to play. But he went to Jacques Demers, the coach of the Habs, who wanted to put him in, and he said, you know what? You guys are up 3-1. You've won 3 in a row. I don't want to bust up this, but here's what I want you to do. Get Sylvain Lefebvre in the lineup, because if he doesn't play tonight, he will not get his name on the Stanley Cup. So Jacques Demers put Lefebvre in the lineup. Denny sat. Habs won the Cup. When Guy Carbonneau got the Cup from Gary Bettman, who was the first guy he handed it to? Denny Savard. So I think it's a little bit of a misnomer because he didn't put up the same points per game in Montreal as he did in Chicago. His value to the Habs in the dressing room was immeasurable. And that was demonstrated by Carbonneau handing the Cup to him first, which, by the way, was the first time that ever happened. That's become the norm since, but that was not the way it was back in the day. Prior to 93, captain took the Cup, took the first lap, and went around, and everybody gathered around, you pass it around. After Carbonneau did that for Denny, that became the norm and the inside thing to do. And then, of course, none more so than Joe Sakic to Ray Bourque in 2001, probably one of the more emotional ones. But there have been many since, but none before. So Denny Savard deserves his Hall of Fame status. He scored 100 points. He scored over 1,000 points. Didn't have the international success. That's just how tough it was to make Team Canada in those days. He did not have a good relationship with Glenn Sather. He got kind of blackballed there a little bit, to be honest. But Les Trois Denis, from an anecdote. He was born in Point Gatineau. He's a good friend of mine. I've worked with him many, many times, and I think the world of him. And he was an unbelievable hockey player. And as you said, in terms of the Savard Spinorama, which is actually a play on a little bit incorporated from his predecessor, no relation, Serge Savard, who was Spinorama, did the Spinorama before Denis. And before Serge Savard did it, Bobby Orr did it. And before Bobby Orr did it, Doug Harvey did it. Doug Harvey was the first defenseman to do the Spinorama. Bobby Orr was the second. Serge Savard was the third. And the fourth person to do it with any regularity was Denny Savard, just to give some historical context. But Denny Savard deserves every accolade as far as I'm concerned. He scored the greatest shorthanded goal in history against the Edmonton Oilers. All you got to do is just hit Denny Savard, shorthanded, Edmonton. There's a little more. We've given some of your young listeners some homework assignments tonight, so there's another one for them.
In a previous podcast, I think the last one or the one that we did before that, we interviewed a gentleman by the name of Bobby Tongs. That name won't mean anything to you, but he was a roadie and worked with the heavy metal band Pantera, and the name Guy Carbonneau came up, as did Ed Belfour, which is another piece of infamous hockey trivia that you might be aware of, because when the Dallas Stars won the Stanley Cup, and I think it was 99, they ended up partying at the Pantera brothers' house, where the Stanley Cup was thrown off the top of the roof and dented on the side of the pool. And we were having a conversation about who actually did that. I'm told it was Guy Carbonneau. He says it's Ed Belfour. And I think the team has tried to keep it under wraps because of the amount of partying that was going on that night.
Well, first of all, there's 4 Stanley Cups, and the original never leaves the hall. So the ones that get, that Messier took to the strip joints, and the ones that have been punted around and thrown off roofs and thrown in pools and everything are not the real cup. So they can do pretty much, they could run it over with a truck. It doesn't matter. They'll just redo another one. But I heard it was Belfour, so I don't know. I wasn't there, and the story will probably live on in infamy. But at the end of the day, is that it's not the real Stanley Cup, and there's a real bowl, the original bowl, and then in 1949 they made a second cup, which was still a real cup because they had everything was real on it, and then they took that out of circulation in 1969. So it's been 2 replicas since then. So you've got a total of 4 Stanley Cups, and they're all engraved, and with the exception of the original bowl, there's only a couple of engravings on it because it's only the size of a flower pot. Basically, it's very small. as you can imagine, in 1893, they didn't build a a stovepipe or a beveled type of operation when the cup came out in when it was commissioned in 1892 and brought across the seas in 1893 and presented to the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association. They were the first Stanley Cup winners. The first game was the following year when Ottawa traveled to Montreal and Montreal Amateur Athletic Association won the Stanley Cup in an actual game, but they were presented with it in 1893. But yeah, I mean, a lot of stories,
Okay, I'll just ask you, I want to wrap this up. So just two more guys. As I mentioned to you, I'm from Calgary. I've never really been a big Flames guy. When I moved to Calgary in 1990, I was big on them at the time when, they had guys like Fleury and Lanny previous to that. But, it's one of the most disappointing trades that I can ever think of, having watched hockey is, what was it? Maybe about 3 years ago now, they paid $1 million up front to take Jaromir Jagr over to the Flames. Thinking that he would play a season with them. I can't remember the stats on it. I think he ended up playing 6 or 7 games, posting about 2 points or something before leaving for the season, then showing up back in over in the Czech Republic the next year. What happened with that season? How bad of a trade is that compared to some of the things that you can recall?
There's so many in history that were so freaking bad.
But I mean, in terms of literally not doing anything, like it's one of the few trades where I can remember that nothing, like it wasn't even that they played, they played their 50 games and they didn't put up numbers. Nothing came of it. And it was big news at the time. It was like, oh, Calgary's finally brought a...
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Possibly an over-the-hill veteran, but it was a big name.
Yeah, well, that's just it. It was a big name, and people were, you're hoping. You never know. I mean, there's a marketing component that probably went into that as well. To be honest, at the end of the day, I have a hard time believing there were credible hockey people thinking that it was like LA signing Kovalchuk. I mean, as soon as they did that, I went, are you kidding me right now? Are you kidding me? Do you think this guy is going to do anything? And then, notwithstanding what he did for the Habs, and then I got a really good look at him. I mean, I was watching the games in LA a little bit, but that he was there, but he was in and out of the lineup. But I mean, Montreal, they threw him in 18, 19 minutes a night. They gave him a couple of guys who could skate with him, and he had a bit of a renaissance. Jaromir Jagr was basically dead from the neck down about 6 years ago. Reminds me of Chris Chelios. Chris Chelios played till he was 47 years old. The last 6 years, like his last games, the same thing, Jess. He played 7 games, I think, with the Atlanta Thrashers. You remember that? He played.
Some people won't remember the Thrashers. But yes,
people won't even remember the Thrashers. Chelios finished his NHL career with the Thrashers, and he was horrible. He was horrible his last 5 or 6 years. He was hanging on. Same with Jagr. Jagr wanted to beat Howe. That's why he hung around and bounced around. Everybody and their brother gave him another shot. Let's bring him in. It's good for marketing. We'll do PR, whatever. He can still skate a little bit, score the odd goal. But he was useless. Got no wheels. He had nothing left in the tank whatsoever. In his prime, he was unreal.
He seems to be
killing it. He was a 5-time Art Ross
back in his reserve league over there.
He deserves everything. He's an automatic first ballot Hall of Famer. He's all the rest, but it's the fact is that, that was, no, I wouldn't even consider that anywhere close to the worst of all time. There's so many, you could argue that, Calgary did a whole lot worse bringing in Milan Lucic than they did Jaromir Jagr. So,
fair enough.
I wouldn't go down the Jagr road with Calgary in that regard. And I'd hate to pile on a guy who had such an outstanding career. The fact is, when Pittsburgh won those cups in 91 and 92, specifically 91, he was a third liner. He was playing with Brian Trottier. He was a kid. He was drafted 5th overall. He was a kid. He was playing on third line. Trottier,
I remember that mullet hair.
Yeah, 92, he was much more of a contributor. But did he ever win another cup? No, he didn't. And what did he do in Washington? You know who killed Bruce Cassidy's career in Washington as a coach? Jagr did. Bruce Cassidy went to Jagr multiple times and said, Jags, here's what I want to do. I want you to set up on your offside like Brett Hull. And we're going to feed you all day. And you can one-time the puck all day. This, Ovi's playing midget, and Yager's in the league, and all Butch wanted to do, and Yager said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I want to float. I'm a rover. I gotta move around. And they got into it, and Yager went to ownership, and next thing you know, Butch is gone. And he was gone forever until he's rescued off the scrap heap after he fought his way back up, coming through all the way up through the ranks again. And look at him now. The Bruins are probably the favorites to win the Cup this year. And they could have won it last year. Lost in Game 7 on home ice with my good dear friend, Bruce Butch Cassidy. And who screwed him in Washington? Yager. But yet everybody waxes nostalgic about the guy like he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Look, I'll admit his talent, but his attitude over a large part of his career was brutal. And when his model ditched him there, he went in the biggest suckathon in the history of hockey. And then there was the other incident there with the chick who tried to sue him or whatever in bed, and he just laughed it off.
I remember the photo in bed.
Yeah, whatever. But you know what? I have so much respect for his talent. And in his prime, he was unfreaking believable. But no, I don't look at that Calgary thing as anything. It was there's so many examples of that. Jess, my God, we could be here another hour if I could cite them since 1917. They've been endless, buddy, endless.
All right, my last question, because I know we've gone over time, but it said there will be a part 2, 3, and 4 of this, I'm sure, down the track. I watch the Canucks. They're the team that I tend to follow. Anyone who knows the team knows that they've never ascended, and that's why it's been so nice to see the Caps and the Blues finally do it this last couple of seasons. Other Canucks fans like myself will be particularly excited by guys like Brock Besser, Quinn Hughes, and Elias Pettersson. It's the latter of them that I just want to get your impressions on these guys, not the team at the moment, but the hype that is surrounding these guys, and in particular, the heavy comparisons that are being built around Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes at the moment. It's obviously too early to tell, but what do you sort of think of these guys?
Well, I love Pettersson to death. I mean, I know he's like maybe a point or two under a point a game guy right now this year, but I think in the future he's going to score 40 plus. I think he's more than a point a game guy. I think he's a 90-point game guy. I absolutely love him to death. Quinn Hughes is the real deal. I mean, whether they give the call to him and Makar, I think Makar probably edges him at the end of the day. But this is the best Vancouver team I think we've seen since 2011. They were on a downward slide for a long, long time. And I think now over the last couple of years, and they have to come out from underneath the Sedins who have been, it's a tough thing, right? You've got legacy guys. You got to carry them. You got to get through term, and you kind of got to go through it and then come out from underneath them. And they have. And I think their fans are being rewarded for it right now. I love their D when they're all healthy. I mean, they've had every team's had injuries, but they have as well. Besser, and he's been banged up this year, right? But I think that guy, if he plays 82 games, he's still a young man. I think if he plays 82 games, he's got 30, 35 goals in him all day. I love his release. I think he's a real deal. They've got 3 or 4 other guys. You hit the nail on the head in terms of the nucleus. I think that's their youth that they're kind of picking up. Tyler Myers, I think, was absolutely monstrous for them from a defense point of view. They've got a couple other nice pieces there, but I think they're also getting the goaltending. For the most part, Markstrom, you could make the case that Markstrom deserves to be in the conversation for the Hart Trophy. I mean, he never would be in it probably by anybody who is actually voting, because the overwhelming majority of them don't watch the games, But Markstrom has been, in my view, absolutely outstanding this year. I think he's been just fantastic. I did a hit on Vancouver radio for years, so I kind of have a soft spot for the Canucks. And the guy I wrote my last book on, Goldie Goldthorpe, lives in Surrey. He's just outside Vancouver, so.
I grew up in Burnaby till I was 10.
Yeah, there you go. And no, I think they're on the right track, and I don't know what's going to happen here now with the coronavirus here. What the hell is going to happen with hockey? But Vancouver are poised to be a playoff team, and they'll be a tough out if everybody's healthy. And whether they play in Edmonton or whomever. And I just like the direction they're going, and I like their youth, and I think Travis Green's a great coach. And they've had other issues too. Like, you take it for granted. You look at the whole thing with Trevor Linden, that did not end well with him off the ice, and this is a legacy guy, and this is a guy who meant everything to that franchise for so long, and then he gets into management and has the breakup that he does, and this just can't be good. I mean, not only are the optics not bad, but just internally how that works cannot be good. And you take a lot of little things for granted. Bringing in Tortorella, huge mistake. I mean, it just go down the line. They just had some things that just obviously flew in the face of what was going to best give them the chance to advance. And now they seem to finally have come out from underneath all that. So I'm a big Canuck fan. I'd love to see them in the playoffs. I'd love to see them go deep. And the names you mentioned, especially Pettersson, I love that guy. I mean, it's just, he's a product of this era, right? Like, you got to insulate him. And because, he's balsa wood. I mean, you can blow on the guy and knock him over. And it's
that concussion he took in the boards last season against, I can't remember who hit him and knocked him out, but it was just, Vancouver's got to build a couple of bigger guys around him for some support.
Sadly, that's the case with a lot of teams. I would cite my own Habs as that. I mean, Shea Weber dropped the gloves for the first time in 4 years in a regulation game, fought Sergachev on Tampa, who was traded in the Drouin deal, and much younger than Shea, obviously, but a big guy. But not to say that Shea lost a fight in any type of devastating fashion or anything. He threw one great big right hand. If that had landed, Sergachev's head would have been in row 4. But the fact is that he just looked awkward. He just looked awkward. And I've said for a couple of years, I mean, you got Zdeno Chara at 42 years old in Boston's had 7 or 8 or 9 fights this year. I mean, he's fighting the world still. If you look at the guy sideways, he's ready. He doesn't care. He'll cross-check you in the head. He doesn't care. He's 6'9". He towers over everybody, and he doesn't care. If you want to pull on Superman's cape, he's ready to go. And Shea, unfortunately, at the front of the net, and he's a beast. They call him the Man Mountain, and he probably up until a couple months ago would have finished third or fourth in the Norris voting. But, the team fell off the rails, and he slid, and then he got hurt, and then he came back, and he's playing through it. And I have nothing but respect for that. Nothing. But, boy, I wish he would channel his a little bit of Zdeno Chara in that. But you're right. Pettersson, you need to insulate these guys. But the sad thing is, Jess, is that a lot of teams won't. They won't. They won't do it.
Well, Canucks are notorious for that. It's been a long time since they've had aggressors in their lineup. They've molded this Swedish playing style for years and have hoped that it's worked out.
Same as Montreal, man. Same as Montreal. Turn the other cheek. Try and get the penalty. Go out there, and basically it becomes 2 minutes that you hope you don't get shorty scored against you because you're useless on the power play like the Habs are. And then you develop a gutless MO. That's what it is. And you got a few guys who'll push back and stand up, but boy, oh boy, I swear to God, if I was coaching, holy Jesus Christ, I'm telling you right now, man, I'd probably be suspended and fined heavily, but I would go down in a blaze of glory. Let me tell you, it would be.
Look, I will mention one thing when you talk about your attitude towards this and how bad John Tortorella was for the Canucks. For anyone listening out there who hasn't seen this, this still remains one of my favorite Canucks
2
moments.
seconds.
Just look up face-off line brawl between Calgary and the Canucks. It is glorious. And Torts doesn't end. It carries on into the hallway and into the dressing room, and it looks like Torts is the one to take them all on. You're right, he was terrible for the team, but that remains one of my favorite moments.
Don't get me wrong. I love the guy as a coach. He's a Stanley Cup winning coach. He won the Cup with Tampa in 2004. We all know that. He played pro hockey.
That was another terrible year for me because that was the last year I was living in Calgary and everyone was on the Sea of Red hype train that year. I remember even when that playoff series was going on and I distinctly remember that series because everyone at that time was buying the red home Flames jerseys, which I believe was the onset of the Sea of Red momentum that carries on through today. And because Tampa's not And because Tampa's not
I
a
think
hockey
most of the
season, they
women
were
were
giving away
topless, I
white
think, Jess.
shirts. And then I remember seeing guys like Hulk Hogan at the hockey going, what the hell is going on over there? And then I think they beat them in 6. And then that was, it was a long time for Calgary after that.
I think it was 7 games, actually, if I'm not mistaken, but,
Was
I
it
think
7?
so. I think Tampa won that in 7, but, it was a hell of a series and a tough one to lose for sure. And, it's just so tough to win, but, yeah, I'm a big fan of all the Canadian teams, obviously, and I love Calgary. I've worked out there a couple times, and I worked the Calgary Stampede for CTV there years ago.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
we had a great weekend out there. But you know what? Yeah, it's not. And Torts in Vancouver, yeah, that was epic because that set an NHL record. Kellen Lane was a young lad that he put out there who fought and broke John Ferguson's long-standing record, which is not in any book, but I guess I'm probably the only guy that knows it. But Fergie had the record for the quickest fight to start an NHL career, 12 seconds, 1963 against Ted Green. Kellen Lane broke that. And Torch was upset that he did that. He regretted it after, but then I loved when he almost got in the room there. Bob Hartley, he would have absolutely kicked the shit out of Hartley had they got it on. Torch can go. I'm a big fan. And you look at what he did with Columbus last year against Tampa. What did he say in the first intermission? It was taped. It was video. They posted it out there. He said, why are you guys backing up from these guys? What have you got to worry about? What is there? Who's over there you got to worry about? Just go at them. And they did. And what happened? Kucherov lost his mind. He lost his mind. And because finally, he went 82 games with no one doing anything against him. And all of a sudden, he had somebody in his face and he snapped. He snapped and he got suspended and they lost 4 straight. And what have they done this year? They are 10 times tougher this year than they were last year. Not only picking up Maroon in the off season, but look at the trade deadline, who they picked up. They are way, way tougher. And I love it. I love it. I think that's great. And it just means that aggressive hockey and rough hockey and tough hockey and guys who are willing to engage physically are still part of our game, despite the left-wing gutless pukes.
Well, look, I was going to say, at least you can follow our Australian league down here, but even that's in jeopardy at the moment. And that season kicks off within the next few weeks. It's really a precarious time, but, Liam, thanks for like always, I always say initially when we start these podcasts with someone, they go, oh, look, I think I got about an hour, 90 minutes to play with. And we oftentimes go well and beyond, but this was very cool because your passion comes through. I think you're a little bit looser and open tonight, which was great. And, I hope that you'll do it again with us.
Yeah, I do apologize for any, vulgarity. And, I'm certainly, I mean, with the gig getting canceled, I went out and had a few pints and I've continued to drink while we've done this, Jess. And I've had a.
Just remember one thing. All you Lemieux fans can go to hell.
I love Mario. I really do. Did you know Mario Lemieux and Patrick Roy are born on the same day, eh?
Yeah, right.
Well, look, same year, same day, same year. Mario Lemieux, Patrick Roy. There you go.
I'm sure that we could probably do just separate podcasts on the 88-89 Cup Finals, the 92-93 Cup Finals, the onset of the Colorado Avalanche. I'm sure there's a hell of a lot of stuff to talk about.
There it is, buddy. Just message me anytime, and thanks for having me on, and I really enjoyed it, and God willing, one of these days I'll get to Australia because I think that country and I would get along famously.
Same people, opposite weather, same attitude, same sense of humor, both Commonwealth. It's all this, and all the hockey's run by Canadians down here. You'd love it. Yeah, right on, man. Well, God willing, one day I'll do that. But listen, in the meantime, I'll stick to the podcasts, and thanks for having me on. You're very welcome. Thanks again. All right, buddy.